or you sleeping. So yeah, it might be a very interesting experience. Yeah, so thanks again for the invitation. I'm going to share quickly my screen. Okay. Yeah, I guess you guys see my screen. Is it working? Okay, perfect. So usually when I'm invited to, well, let's start it this way. I usually hate to talk, give lectures, but if I have to, I usually talk about design. I usually talk about our projects, about our work. This is somehow the area where I feel really comfortable talking about. But when Valeria and the student body actually sent me the invitation with the topic of empowerment, and also the question of what does empowerment mean to us, it got me a little bit thinking, and I changed my lecture. It will be a little bit of a different lecture, maybe a more personal one. The question of empowerment is an interesting one, but maybe not the question of how we can be empowered by design, but rather how we can be empowered to be able to design. I'm not so sure about you guys, but I have my most creative phases when I don't have to worry about anything else than creativity, when I can fully focus on designing, and when I'm not so distracted by the world outside. So this is when this is my foundation, when I'm able to design. This is, of course, very difficult thing to do, especially in times like this when so much stuff is going on. And I remember that I had this one as a student, that I was fully able to concentrate on designing and being creative. But after I graduated and started our office, it seems in retrospect that I lost it a little bit. But I think then I mean my wife and myself, we did a full 180 in what we were doing, and restructured our life completely differently, and somehow created a foundation where we felt finally again empowered to really design. So I think the interesting question, especially for young architects and for students, is not so much of how can we be empowered by design, but how can we be empowered to design. Yeah, so today's lecture will be about that. It will be not just about our work and about our design, but more about the foundation that is beyond the design. So it will be a little bit about business. It will be a little bit about strategy. It will be about maybe our generation, about our tasks, about our challenges, and of course also that I feel a bit comfortable in talking also about a little bit about design. I feel that this one is probably the most personal lecture I give, so I try to tell a little bit our story of how we started, and empowerment in the end is a very personal thing for everyone, by him or herself. So I thought, I'm going to tell a little bit the story of how we started, how we got our first projects, what motivated us in our first projects, and how we made some decisions that might sound for a lot of architects weird or wrong, but I think those were exactly the decisions that built this foundation for us, or that built those foundation that empowers us at the moment. Maybe one more thing in the beginning, that this one it's not a how-to guide, although I tell a little bit the story of how we got our first project and what our steps were, but this is not, for everyone. Probably it's not for anyone of you. Architecture, design, and the work and projects in general are all very personal. I think architecture is a very personal craft. So this, the way you grow up, the way where you grow up, it all somehow influences the design you're creating. So it doesn't maybe work for any one of you, but I think it somehow worked for us. So this is more like an honest lecture about what we learned in the last year, our mistakes, what we find annoying about architecture, so yeah, let's dive in. So my personal architectural story actually starts with my father. I always show this slide in the beginning of my lectures because my dad was an incredible, influential person for me. As you see there, my dad was pretty crazy. He was a climber, not just climbing. He was a free solo climber. That means without any gear, any security, any ropes, just him and the mountain. And my dad was also very talented in what he was doing. I think if you ask the legends of climbing, many of them would say that my dad was one of the most talented climbers for a long time. But he, as talented he was in what he was doing, and as creative he was in finding new routes through the mountains, as bad he was in business skills, in strategies. My dad never made any money with climbing. He actually he put away all the sponsorships because he was fearing a lot that he turns his hobby or his passion he has for climbing into a job, and that he would take on some responsibilities he doesn't want to have. Fortunately, I think I inherit some creative thoughts from my dad on one side, but unfortunately, I also got a lot of his business or non-existing business skills from my father. Me personally, I was never the person to make a plan how to grow our business or how to set up a successful office, to have a good business plan. I was always more the introvert person to sit on the computer to model and render, I still like to do this part of the job, but not the other part. But I think, as when you start out with your first project, you necessarily have to ask yourself, how will I survive with this? I mean, it will be a boring question, a hard one to answer, but I think a very necessary one. And for us, it was mainly, how can we get our first project? Can we even get our first project, or do we have to work for someone else's dream for a while? By then, I think this was around 2013, 2014. My wife, Faye, she already graduated. She recently graduated. I was in the middle of our diploma, and then we got ourselves invited. I really say it this way. So we got ourselves invited to participate in a competition. And this one was our first project. As I said, I don't go too deep into projects today. I tell more the story behind those projects. One of you who are from China or who visited China, this seems probably very familiar for you. The public plazas in front of shopping malls and everywhere, they turn into a communal dance in the evening. And the project or the competition we won as our first project was was kind of to create a plaza where people in the evening can meet, dance together, but also serves a bit as an entrance gate to a flower garden. So this sculpture, we won with this sculpture, and maybe we won the competition by having an okay design, but maybe we also won it because we had a very good business strategy. We lied. So, I remember that Faye and me, we were in Vienna, and we had to present this project like I present to you today over Zoom. I think it was something like Cisco, but we just had to share our screen, and they didn't see our faces, and we had to talk to the project. And the jury and the client, they were sitting in China. So for us, it was pretty early in the morning. We were sitting very professional with our pajamas on the kitchen table, and to make it, sound more professional, we had, some office. I googled, YouTube office sound and put it on the speakers then as a background, and it really sounds, like it's a big office. It sounds like a professional office. There were some faxes going, and people chatting. There were cell phones ringing. And maybe, the client said, okay, they are a professional couple. We're going to invite them to build the design. And well, maybe, we got then all of that. So a couple of years later, then we got people with cell phones in the office. We got a fax machine. So yeah, maybe we didn't lie so much, but we were a bit chronologically challenged on this one. And then we built this entrance gate. It turned out to be quite successful. So there were a lot of sensors then within the sculpture. So they measured the movement that was going on this plaza. The more movement there was in the plaza of people dancing, the brighter and more illuminated those fins got. And this was basically our stepping stone into the architectural world. So this one was a foundation, at least, where we can then found our office on. After this project, Faye and me, we moved then to Beijing. We set up a studio there with a friend of ours. We called ourselves Panda. And this one was then the first 4 years of our architectural career. The office or the name we worked in. And we worked then in China on a couple of different projects. It started with very small projects, of course, for some installations, some interior designs. Another interior design we built near the skiing slopes in Beijing. A hotel. We finalized some galleries and museums we did in this while. Then some larger projects, but it felt all good as an architect. It was growing. The team we had, it felt good to work with the people. The partners I had, it was cool to work with them. Also, the project were fun to work on, but I somehow there was something missing. I couldn't really pinpoint at this time what was missing, but I somehow felt, there could be more in architecture. And then we started to work on this project. And this one was a really interesting one because the process of the project was very different. So at this time, my wife Faye and me, we traveled to Bali. We met there with Elora. She has a company called Ibuku. They are building beautiful bamboo buildings. Some of you probably know it from, I think, Apple TV's Home had her featured in their last season. And Green School is very, very famous from them. And we were both very inspired by bamboo. Faye is also coming a little bit with a background in bamboo from the south of China. And we always had this idea of a modular building system in bamboo in our head. And after coming then back from Bali, we really wanted to dive into that. So this project in the beginning, it didn't have any client, it didn't have any site. We were just really interested in developing something by ourselves. So really developing a building component by ourselves. So it also felt very freeing as a process in a project. There was no one we had to report to. There was no deliverables. There were no deadlines. There were no compromises, which is very important. But we also didn't know, where this journey of the project really leads us. But yeah, we still wanted to try. So this testing phase, it actually got on for more than, I think, 2 years. Where we really developed in small models, then one-to-one mock-ups. Then we ordered 700 bamboo canes and built near our office on a site we rented, built this little pavilion. All of the people actually seeing their building was our team, because we wanted to get more information of how structural the bamboo works and what works and what doesn't work. After we learned from this one, we redefined then the joint of this one. All of this is still like 2 years now going on, and all still self-funded without any client or without ever publishing it. This one are then some experiments of how you can actually make an 8-meter or 10-meter bamboo cane grow like double the size by tripling the amount of bamboo used. All of this then needs spaces, so this one needs to be a very flexible material in between the bamboo, so there's no friction between the material. So all of these ones, we developed within this process. So it was a very fruitful and hands-on process for our team. And then we started, to implementing all these thoughts into very different designs of buildings. All of them have the same joint, have the same component in its center. But they can reach very different shapes and very different outcomes. We then published the whole project, and it got published widely because we were not just publishing the process we made so far, but we also published it under an umbrella of a vision. So what could be possible with this, right? What could, or at least asking questions, right? Could bamboo be the steel of the century? And could bamboo actually come back to our city in a certain way? Or how would bamboo skyscrapers actually look like? So we published it under this umbrella, and it got widely then distributed on media. And with that, then we found then clients. So the first client was in Ecuador, a filmmaker who contacted us that he wants to build a surf hotel. It was, again, a really cool process. We sent our project architect then for 3 months to Ayampe in Ecuador, building the first bamboo sheds. And so in all this one, it was a very interesting process, and the project itself was so different than all the previous projects we had done in the more conventional way, where we had a client from the beginning and then serving the client. This process, it felt much freer, and for me, it somehow was then clear that I wanted to do more of these kind of self-initiated projects, especially as a young architect. I think they deliver a great amount of opportunity. But also at this time, our office, because this project got published widely, our office grew a little bit. We won some awards then, and we got a bit of a wider platform. And also with that, opportunities came, and somehow you then feel a little bit like this dog in this Pixar movie Up, who is always hunting squirrels and seeing squirrels, and is constantly distracted by the opportunities to hunt squirrels. And it felt a little bit, like being this dog, and you want to do then everything, and then you grow also in a size with your office where you have to do almost everything, and that puts you somehow in a wheel where it's really hard to get out. As I said before, I really love to work on the computer, to work with my hands, and being part of the process. But I found myself then writing more and more emails, doing more and more client meetings, flying to more and more sites. And the work of architecture I initially really loved changed a lot for me. And I felt a little bit disconnected from the process of a project. And then, with this pressure to acquire new projects, because now you have a backpack of 15 to 20 people that you need to put to work. That means also, again, struggling in this hamster wheel and running faster and faster. This pressure also builds up, and I then found myself in a stage where I was really burned out, and where architecture, it wasn't fun anymore. Not at least how I experienced it as a student, and not how I experienced like starting the company. So for Faye and me, I think it became really clear that we needed to change something. This one was like end of 2016, 2017. My dad just died. He fell from the mountain and died in Greece. So for us, it was clear, okay, we move now back to Austria, that we are, of course, closer to my mom, but also because we had the wish to start our own family, to somehow take a little bit this pace out from our life. So we didn't move then to any city in Austria or to any village. We really moved to the mountains, to the middle of nowhere. This is where I actually am sitting right now. And at first, this was it was a difficult decision. This didn't come easy, because our office in China, it was running pretty well. We had good clients and good projects. And now Faye and me, we were sitting again at the kitchen table in our pajamas and ask ourselves, what did we do? Why did we actually do that? We didn't have any clients then. All of a sudden, we didn't have any work. So basically, we had to start from the beginning. But we also didn't need a lot at this stage. We were living here. We have a garden. We were growing a lot of our own vegetables, and we were starting again to develop a strategy for our office that was, though, completely different than the one we had before in Beijing. At this time, it was also good to somehow change the pace, to eat your own vegetables and grieve over our dead, and really cleared our thoughts at this time. But it became pretty clear that we wanted to set up a different office than what we had before, one that is really focused on a healthy work-life balance. We also really wanted to create a small office. We didn't want to grow irresponsibly, so we wanted to keep it as small as somehow possible. And then we slowly then grew, and of course, we wanted to implement the self-initiated projects as a cornerstone of an office strategy. And then we found some first projects. We slowly grew again. We built, as you can see on the video, we built a small office, also here in the mountains. Actually, I'm sitting in here at the moment. And then we started very slowly to hire people. Our first employee then was Andy. He came to us from London. This one I think was 2018 or so. And then a year later, we hired our second employee, our second full-time employee, Luca. We were very lucky that he somehow diminished his architectural ambitions and came and quit that MVRDV and came to us. So this is now actually our core team we have here. So we are still very, very small. In the third year, then Gigi joined us. She's taking care mainly about on our Asian side on the projects. So it was a very, very slow pace growing, but and trying to keep small at any means somehow possible. And I think now somehow we are at the stage where, or at least at the location where when the weather is nice, then we can go outside and do some skiing, backcountry skiing or hiking. And when the weather is not so good, we have some time to do some architecture. But the interesting part about that we changed here to the countryside is that actually the life we are living is heavily, I think, influencing the work we are doing. I didn't think that before, but like especially when it comes to authenticity in architecture, I always thought you probably authenticity in architecture means that you are authentic in the place you're building. But through this move, actually, I experienced how much it influences your own sense of design, where you live, how you grew up, and your personal stories that somehow goes into the design. So, for example, we love gardening. We love to grow our own food, and we try to somehow get also our food from nearby farms. So to be really local with what we consume. And I think this one, also then is part of the project we try to do. So this one is another self-initiated project with exactly these thoughts. So how can architecture maybe combine agriculture on one hand and the building and living on the other hand? And I think because it is self-initiated, the project starts at a different pace. It starts where mainly also student projects started. It started with experimentation and research and history. Like for example, since the agricultural revolution, food or agriculture was always a very big part of our living situations. So they went really hand in hand. We knew for the most of our species, life of our species, where our food is coming from. But this then, of course, changed with refrigeration, with the invention of refrigeration and with the invention of railway. That suddenly, our food moved outside of our eyes and also moved outside of our minds. And because we are not connected to food anymore, we are actually living a quite unhealthy diet. We have a spike in obesity, a spike in diabetes, and so forth. So like in all these projects, like in the self-initiated projects, they come just from a different stage that is not basically design driven, but is more first research experimental driven. And then comes the question, okay, what can we do? How would actually architecture look like that combines both of them? And as our bamboo project, for example, also this one started with very small scale. It started with some living pots for refugees who at this time, came to Austria and they didn't have a work permit. So we developed some little pots that are modular, that are expandable when their family is coming afterwards, and they are able then to grow their own food, as food is always, the first a kind of a band-aid that keeps cultures together, and a first step then as well for a local integration here, that you can, sell your vegetables to your local surrounding and to your neighborhood, and it becomes a kind of a community-driven process then. And if the predictions we hear all the times are true, that, for example, in the next 35 years or 30 years until 2050, more food will be consumed than in the last 10,000 years combined, and more than 80% of this food will be consumed in cities, and a vast majority of people will live in cities in the future. You can only surmise what opportunities that could mean for architects to design, for city planners, for ecologists, for horticulturalists, to design cities much different, to design buildings that are more than just expensive real estate, to design buildings that are really productive, that can feed a neighborhood and a community. So, city centers that are maybe not defined by banks or insurance companies, but more defined by parks and vertical gardens and rooftop gardens. So cities not driven by greed, but more driven by health and vitality. And that could be a fundamental change of opportunity for architects of how to design in the future. And so we tried then as well in the next step then to implement all of these thoughts then into this self-initiated project. And you see that somehow this, these kind of projects, they are coming from a different place. They come from this research experimental base, and not necessarily from this constant circle of budget constraints, of compromises, of deliverables, of deadlines, and so forth. So I think as a project, therefore, I think those self-initiated projects are really fundamental, even though they are not getting built. They are still really important, I think, because they could inspire then, other people to build upon this base and then getting their vision one time realized. For this project, actually, we found as well a client. So this one will be our main project in 2022 to develop. We will develop it for a really prominent site in Montreal, and we have a really incredible team already gathered of wood builders, engineers, vertical gardeners, horticultists, building technicians. So it will be a very interesting process to as well move forward with this one. I somehow like these self-initiated projects, not just because of the process of the project, but also because of their business model. And I said before, I don't really like to think about this, but of course, if you're running a project, an office, you also have to think about the business side of things. And the conventional business model for architects is actually a pretty bad one. I think Rem Koolhaas said that that we as architects, we are in the business of uniqueness, and as a as a business, this is a really shitty business, because uniqueness is not scalable. As an architect, if I design, for example, a house, I need a team maybe of two partners or two team members. If I get an airport, I have to scale up my team, but my margin somehow stays exactly the same. It's unlike, for example, an industrial designer who designs a really cool chair, and this one can be sold 1 million times. So this one would be a scalable business model, but architecture is not a scalable business model. And if, it's not scalable, then for my personal feeling, why should I try to hustle to really grow and having a big team? The second problem I find with the conventional business model for architects is that the creativity, the core of our being, is not valued in this business model. So every country has their own fee structure for architects, what they, for example, can charge for a project. But this is always a pretty straight line from start to finish. But as we all know, creativity is everything but straight. It's a process that takes really weird paths. There are times where we fail miserably with some designs, and then we have to go back to the drawing board. We maybe find something, then we discover, oh my goodness, MVRDV did that already. Then we start again, trying to find our path, and slowly but surely, we find something that works. But this process, is not really valued, just the result is. I, for example, was when we started our office here, I was working on a little house. I think I did like 5. Faye was already pregnant, but then we didn't hire Andreas at this point, so it was mainly me. That's why I know how long I worked on this project. Otherwise, I'm not counting hours. But it was around 1,500 hours or so for the design work. I did like 6 different designs, 250 renderings or so. So it was really a lot of work, and I calculated then, and I made an hourly fee of around $6. But I would completely redo it again, right? I would completely do it again because it's a fun project. Next year it starts construction. The client is really happy with it, but somehow this is like this creative part is not somehow measured in the business model of architecture, and maybe it actually shouldn't be, because why should the client pay for this messiness? Because business is about predictability, but creativity is very unpredictable, and that maybe this one is actually the eternal struggle when it comes to architecture and business. And I think the third big issue about the conventional business model in architecture is that it's not really transparent for a client. When it comes with a vague brief, the client doesn't know what the outcome of a project is going to be. Of course, this is part of the process, but it's still very intransparent. But if we talk about self-initiated project, I think that gives us a very different alternative business model. So it is completely scalable, because especially if you design some building components or building systems or modular buildings, then it is very much scalable. For example, we did this project last year. It's still ongoing. It's a little kiosk for a coffee chain. And very modular, so it comes in very different configurations. It's very flexible and adaptable to any given site or configuration. And we built now, I think yesterday was the opening of the second one of these ones in Hong Kong. At the moment, there are 8 of those under construction. So it becomes more like a product design, and therefore it is really scalable. And because it is scalable, you also can factor creativity into your business model again, and it becomes completely transparent, because if if, for example, those franchise people for the coffee chain come to us and say, okay, we have this size of a site, we can say within a couple of hours, okay, these are your 5 different options you can go for. This one costs you this one costs you this, and so forth. We can deliver at this point. So everything becomes really transparent in a way for our clients. So there is much less friction than in the process of a project. So I thoroughly enjoy this somehow, these self-initiated projects. Which brings me to my last little project. I don't go too deep into it as a design part, but also, this one was a self-initiated project. It's not just my favorite project we have ever worked on, but it has such an interesting and fun process because it was initiated by ourselves. So I think 2 years ago, I met with a friend of mine called Rudi. Rudi is not an architect. He's more an organizer, into management, into marketing. He really likes to connect with people. So everything Faye and me are not really good at and are not really interested in. He's very good at. And this project would have been never built, of course, without the architects, but it also would have been never built without him and his skill set. So, I think this is a fundamental opportunity for self-initiated projects, that you can team up with people who share a vision and share the passion to do something together. For us, for this project, it was very important that we develop a building with a very minimal footprint. That we really ask ourselves, okay, what do we need, and how small can we really build? So if we have a minimal footprint, the building itself will go towards the top. It will be a vertical building. It was also important to connect people to the forest, to nature, to our natural environment, to our ecosystem. And of course, super important that we create a building that is maybe not a building, but more like a character, more like a cartoon character, a quirky little thing, but that creates somehow emotions and feelings for people. And is because then I think people have a special bond then to a building, and they feel connected on a very different level to a building. So also this one very modularly built up and developed. And then, of course, the next steps of giving this whole thing really alive and developing it with partners, the wood builders, the structural engineers, material technicians, because as you can see, it used very high technological materials. So CLT, but bent CLT. There are not a lot of factories in the whole, I think there's maybe just one in the whole world who is doing that. They are in Eastern Tyrol, so in Austria nearby us, and they are doing bent CLT. Then this bent CLT gets cutted, also highly technological, with a robot from the car industry. Here you can see the cuts it's making. So I think the project itself is probably a project of our time. I'm not sure if it would have been possible to build even 2 years ago, because this machine did not exist 2 years ago. So this wood builder didn't have the machine 2 years ago. We would have had to invent it for that reason. And I don't think it would have been possible to build in a conventional wood building system. Yeah, here you have all those rollings, how they're lining up, being transported to site, and then the wood builder is already constructing them. And you really see how this jigsaw puzzle is coming together and how those elements fit, because it was a rapid prototype. And I don't think it would have been possible any other way to build this one in wood. And you see like the detailing of the wood builder, the seam, for example, that goes through the interior, that, yeah, this is millimeter work, and the precision is just incredible within the space. So yeah, our first 4 birds are now, at least the exterior is done. At the moment, they are building the interiors, carpentry, floors, heating, and so forth. In a couple of months, this one should be also done. So yeah, I think with this one, I somehow leave it to you guys in case you have any questions. So this one was, just our little story so far. I know that we are not old yet. We are like 7 years old. We just had our first day in school as a 7-year-old, and we know there's a lot to come. And I am also fully aware that as architects, we are probably our best when we are in our 60s and our 70s. So what we somehow try here to grow really responsible and in a very slow pace is also a little bit of an energy preservation, that when we are in a time where we really are experienced as an architect and confident as an architect, that we still have the motivation to do architecture. And because it would be a bummer if we would lose this enthusiasm along the way. So somehow it's really somehow the story of how we try to create a healthy lifestyle, that we also can be architects then when we are a bit older. Okay, so thank you, guys.
Yeah, see all the clapping. Thank you so much for that. I know there were a few questions already in the chat, and I encourage anyone there to drop some more. Well, first, yeah, thank you for that presentation. That was a great presentation. And I just want to start with allowing the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get the questions rolling. So.
I guess I'll go first. Hi, I'm Jackson, and I'm an undergrad first year. My pronouns are she and her, and I currently in New York, but I grew up in Kansas City.
I'll go next. I'm Eyal. I'm from Costa Rica, currently here in Costa Rica. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm very excited. Thank you for your lecture.
Hey everyone, I'm X. I'm from Long Island, New York. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm excited to be speaking with everyone.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a second-year graduate student. I'm from New York City. My pronouns are he, him. And yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm calling in from New York. I'm from Kansas. My internet stopped working, so that's why I'm now coming in from my phone propped up on my laptop. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was like a great lecture. And I guess we can start off with the questions from panelists. X, do you want to start with your question? I think it's a really like kickoff.
Yeah. So a big branding piece for your company is these animated GIF renderings that sort of like mimic the way a physical model might look. And I'm just wondering what the history of that was and where that all started.
I think the basis of it is because I'm lazy. I do like to create models as well, but and I do like to create renderings as well. But I think there is something in between. So creating a model that you really present to a client takes a lot of time, and photoshopping a rendering used to be a lot of time. Now, you create everything in 3D, and there is less photoshopping involved in a rendering. But I think those little model renderings show a lot of things and makes a lot of things very obvious to the client presentation, right? When it comes to, for example, scale, when it comes to sizes of different elements and building components, but also when it comes to materials and light studies. So I think there is a lot of things you actually can achieve with that in a very minimal amount of work. So the project or the whole process becomes much more efficient. And especially if you do, like, for example, we just did a hotel design and we created, I think, 12 different designs for the first meeting. So if I would now, render for each design 5 renderings, which you probably need, and Photoshop all of this, it would take an incredible amount of time. But with those ones, basic decisions, what you should decide in the first meeting, can be already decided. So I think it's a very efficient way of creating a common base with your client.
Yeah, and I think it represents the design very successfully. That when you look at elevations or plans, it's difficult to see all of the layers, but in the way you show it, it breaks it down in such a very clear way.
Right, and you can do very easily a build-up, right, where you can, the building arises and you get a really good understanding of what's going on inside a building and inside the structure and so. So yeah, it's a very helpful way of presenting, but it's a tool. Yeah.
Okay, and so just to start with some of the questions, there was one about the business model. Varun, if you want to say your own question, if you want us to say it, we can say it for you. Okay, I'll read the question. So Varun says that the business model is great, and can you elaborate on how scalability gets the transparency of process, which the conventional model does not have?
Yeah, I somehow, like the relationship between a client or to a client can be a very weird one, because he or she doesn't have the insight into what's going on the day to day. So the first time a client sees the project is most of the time, at least, in the first meeting. But actually, all those iterations within a project, so this whole messy process of failing, going back, and restarting, and sleepless night, getting into a depression because you cannot find any ideas. All of this one, it's not really visible. And so in this sense, it becomes really intransparent, and it's also on the client side that who knows if this outcome is then really what they wanted. I have heard from a lot of clients, okay, they're surprised, but this is not really what we were looking for. Of course, this is also a process where you have to grow as an architect, to find some strategies. For example, how to get the client into the process, so the client somehow feels part of the design team, which makes the whole process so much easier. But compared to self-initiated project, it still is a very intransparent way of showing the process. Which is, it's completely fine. We are not just doing here in the office self-initiated projects. Like, we have a good balance of those. So we enjoy both, but I think they are really nice if you have both. So on one side, you have the compromises. Architecture is somehow the art of the compromise of a lot of different parties to get something built. But I think like the office itself is really fruitful if you somehow have both. So sometimes you have to compromise, you have to deal with budget, you have to deal with wishes. But on the other hand, there are sometimes some projects where you can go completely free and really true to your vision.
Take it.
So I have a question related to the business model. So nowadays it's very difficult for young architects to do their own work and follow their vision and make it real. And for us, your projects embody pretty much your vision. So our question is, like, many of your projects are often conceptual and speculative and have that like scalable character. There are many of them are modular. So do you think there are other architects that are aiming towards this business model that I never heard it before, or seen it before, but do you think it's something that will gain popularity?
Yeah, maybe. It's difficult to say because I think we just can afford that because we are small. I think maybe for sure an office like Bjarke or so, they can afford it because they just have incredible manpower. But especially if you're an office which is between 5 and 20 people, it's very difficult because you have like the pressure on your backpack, as I said a bit in the lecture, builds up the more people you have in this range. So I think we have this freedom because we are a very small office, and just because of that we are able to do that. But I find it a smart way actually for young architects, because I mean there is either the way you go as a young architect towards competition, or you go towards a project that you self-initiate and where you think, okay, this one is important. The problem with competition is that you do again a unique project for a unique client on a unique site with unique circumstances, and most of those projects, if you lose, they end up in a drawer and you never open them again. The same thing, it happened to me when I did my diploma. I thought, okay, I'm going to do a competition, and then I will not win the competition. I was sure of that. But then I take this competition as a base to develop my diploma further. So I took this brief, and then, of course, I didn't win in the competition, but I was then so demotivated to, again, take a losing project to develop it into my diploma, that I completely started from scratch. So, I don't think that competitions are super smart to do a lot of them. Like we do basically none of them anymore. But I think that something, that where you think that is really important for the future, and that this could be a really interesting topic to dive deeper in. I think that that could for sure be a strategy for a lot of young architects. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris, I know you had, or Paul, yeah, you can ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you mentioned the future, which is on a lot of people's mind. So in terms of a lot of your projects deal with sort of sustainability and the sustainable future, so to speak. Do you see sustainability primarily as a technological design problem, or do you? And I guess the follow-up to that would be: do you think that there's some sort of ethical responsibility, a political responsibility for architects to like leverage their their will in the construction industries towards a more sustainable future? And if you do that, how do you do that without getting fired?
Oh, you mean within a company? Yeah, I mean, it can be, it can be such a hypocritical topic, sustainability. There was the signature for the emergency climate crisis. I think it was in England, and all of the famous architects signed it. And then the next day, Zaha published this glass skyscraper filled with air conditioning in the south of China, everything but sustainable. It can be such a hypocritical topic in architecture. And you won't, I totally understand that, of course, sustainability, it needs to be measured in some sort of way. And, technology is a good way of making projects more sustainable. But I'm also a bit fearful that, this is a bit of an excuse for architects to use. We put a lot of nice and new technology into buildings, and then this one is a check. It just uses this amount of energy, and it's a sustainable building. But I think to sustainability comes much more, because I think sustainability becomes really interesting when you cannot measure things. So, for example, in China, there is at the moment this strategy to bring the convenience of the city to the countryside, right? All this technology of the city, so that people are not moving away from the countryside. But I think we also could, especially here in the West, we could also think this exactly the different way. So how can we bring actually the qualities of the countryside to the buildings in the city? Good air, close to nature. Having a healthy neighborhood, knowing your neighbors. So all of these things, I think they create sustainable buildings that are not necessarily measurable, but they bring a certain longevity to a building, right? If you, for example, have a good community in your building, you take care of your building because you really love this building, and you maintain the building, and then the building is not demolished after 30 years, but it will stand, maybe 70 or 100 years. So all of these factors, they are part of sustainability. And I think the important thing for the future is not just that we build more intelligence in our cities, more data collecting, more surveillance, whatever, but also that we create more consciousness in the city. And I think this happens not through more technology in buildings, but really happens through, gardens, nature, all of those imperfect things that we try to bring to buildings. I think these are, a big part of sustainability that is maybe not measurable, but will have a really important feature in the architecture of the future.
So since we're talking about sustainability and nature, I just wanted to ask, so in Japanese architecture, there's concept that their architecture is not meant to surpass nature, as we often see in the West, but rather to coexist with nature. How would you describe the role that your works play in this sense? I guess what is your take on architecture hosting or surpassing nature versus coexisting with nature?
Yeah, I think not just in in Japanese architecture. I think you have this also in a lot of, like, for example, the Alpine style in Austria. That architecture, it needs to coexist with nature, and it always did, right? I mean, there is a reason for the buildings why they are built as they are built, right? They are shaped by hundreds of years of building intelligence. But maybe we lost a lot of that due to the Industrial Revolution, now the international style. So everything becomes very similar and efficient, and everything looks somehow very the same in a way. But yeah, I think at least there should be some maybe a building regulation that you have to give back at least the space to nature that you took away from it in order to construct the building. I think that is somehow a given. But yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities actually that could go much further when we are thinking about green facades and green and vertical gardens and so yeah. With all of these new disciplines coming into architecture, I think it could be a fantastic opportunity actually for architects to create more healthy buildings.
Thank you.
Yeah. In your lecture, you talked a lot about authenticity, and the theme around your firm, it seems, you guys hold authenticity to a very high regard. So my question is, how does a designer remain genuine and true to their work and interests early on in their career, especially when they're trying to acquire work and really it's about maybe gathering a resume or building that or a portfolio? What would your advice be to a young designer who wants to remain authentic to their creativity while starting out, basically?
Yeah, difficult topic also for myself. I also, there are a lot of times where I feel, like a hypocrite to preaching water and drinking wine and so. But life is somehow a learning process, right? Like this. When I was a student, I was a lot in libraries and just checked out the work of other architects, and we all sounded a lot like other voices until we find somehow our own, and I think that's good. That's part of learning, but for us it was really then when we found our own voice was when we somehow went back to the roots, where I grew up in, and when we somehow combined this with the roots that Faye grew up. So, for example, with the bamboo building was really one of those projects where it felt, even though I've never seen bamboo before, but it felt authentic. My dad was not just a crazy climber, but also a carpenter. So I was constantly surrounded by wood, and I had to rediscover my passion again for wood. But once I did, and once we lived then here in the mountains, this one felt just authentic. Like this is where my roots are, and this is also where Faye's roots are. And I think then it doesn't matter so much if, as I said one time in a lecture, that if MVRDV did something similar already, right? Because you come from a different base, right? Your project comes from a much different, from a much more personal foundation, and then it feels very authentic. But authenticity is also easily, especially personal authenticity, could be easily lost in the process of a project, right? Because there are a lot of compromises you have to deal with, especially if you are starting out, and if you don't have the body of work or the confidence to really stick to your guns. So yeah, it can be a very difficult topic, but never forget that we get good as architects when we are old, and everything until then is a learning process. And this is being authentic, I think, is really something you should achieve when you are experienced and an old architect. Until then, you work towards that, but it's all very much a learning process.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there's a question in the chat box that says, I don't know if you want to read it out. It says, can you describe your relation with simple geometry? Do you prefer simple geometry to parametric organic forms, or just forms just happens as part of your design?
Yeah, simple is a thing. I would consider a circle pretty simple, but to build it, like for example, to get bird off the ground, it was everything but simple. It was probably the most complex and challenging thing we have ever done. Whereas, a shapy thing, per example, this snow apartment or so, which was really complex shapes and double curved surfaces, was fairly easy to build compared to bird. So complex and something that looks simple doesn't necessarily have to be simple. But on a design part, I somehow like clear forms. I like things where I can explain every point in the design. I did, I studied under Sahadid and then Schumacher, and I did all of parametric stuff, and I did crazy shapes and so in my studies, but it never. I couldn't explain, for example, why I have to use here a double curved surface. It didn't feel, maybe authentic. But if I can explain every point in the project, and I know, I can, I have an answer to any questions within the project, why I decide or why we designed it this way, then I'm on a much more confident base then.
And while we're on the topic of parametricism, there are a lot of new, really great digital tools that are coming around. And I'm curious, which ones are you interested in, coming from seeing it more as a tool and not an aesthetic? What kind of excites you and you're like, wow, I gotta learn that?
I'm not excited about it, but I think we have to grow up a little bit and we have to go towards BIM. I'm everything but excited, but I think we have to do it. And it makes sense, a lot of our projects in the last couple of years were in China or in India, or pretty gathered around. So it didn't, there was not the need necessarily to go BIM because everyone was on different platforms and you had to converse it again. But now with, my 5 or 10-year strategy is to change from an international architect to a local architect and somehow try to get a little bit like the reversed way, and get more projects in this area. So, I can go there by train or by at least a battery in my car, and don't have to fly so much. But having more projects than here, it makes sense to be on the same platform with the wood builders, with the structural engineers, to have everything. And like it just makes sense. I'm not excited about it because I think I still will design with the tools I'm working at the moment. But I think as an office platform, it makes sense to do it and to grow up.
Hello.
Segues really well into a question that I'd written beforehand. Because you, as you mentioned, your firm is definitely like an international firm, right? Like it does work everywhere. And that's interesting to hear that you'd like to move to a more local mindset, especially when you take into the consideration of the motto of, think global, act local in terms of sustainability. Like how do you find your projects fitting into like plugging into the local community in that way when you are, somewhere in the mountains of Austria and you're building something and you're designing something for a culture that you have, very little experience with?
Right. Really interesting question. And I should think more. I actually thought a little bit about this as well in the last years. It somehow feels as well like for me, working in other cultures, I find it very often hypocritical to talk, about a culture and base it there without knowing too much about it. But I think a project is very often also, much more than just like the tradition of a place or how you root or how, you create a metaphor for the project. It's also very much about craftsmanship, for example. So for the snow apartment, in the north of China, I had no idea of the north of China, neither had my wife because she's from the south. But, we talked with local craftsmen what they are really good at for example. And they were fantastic in plastering. So we designed a project that used plaster as their main defining material. Because we knew, they will be very interesting in creating something that is a bit out of the ordinary, but we are also ensured to get a really good result in it. Then, for example, designing the project in Ecuador, where we were not connected to the local community. Like we sent a project team there for 3 months to really teach what we learned from our building model, building system in bamboo, to teach that to the local builders and the local community, but also to learn from the local community, right? Like which bamboo is local, which one can we use, how large are those, and then develop this one with them together. So we, even though we're a small team, we still try. We don't have so many projects, so we can afford that the project architect is then going there to really spend some time there. We also did a project together with Arthur Mahmoud Mani in Riyadh last year, which was 2 years ago, which was about sand printing. And our project team was constantly there for more or less 4 months, either Arthur's team or then our team. So we try to really engage then locally at the where it's possible. But of course, it is also like all of this one, brings me back to that I try, if possible, to bring the projects we're working on a bit closer to our firm.
Thank you. That's a very
Hello. So my name is Elsa and I'm from Lebanon. And I wondered if do you think that the future of architecture should be more focused on collective housing and social living?
Yes. No, of course. I mean, architect, like it's very weird what's happening in a lot of city, right? That architecture becomes really or is reduced to being expensive real estate. And honestly, real estate that doesn't have a lot of soul in it. It's not that, those projects that are selling for millions and millions of dollars are so unique. I think like maybe as an architect, maybe it's even more interesting and creative to work on social housing and with budget constraints than with the most expensive materials. Like, for example, my dad, he was a good free climber, but he was a very bad high altitude climber, but he still tried it, like, because the most famous climbers, they climbed the Mount Everest, they climbed the K2, the Nanga Parbat. So my dad also went to the Himalayas to climb Nanga Parbat and Cho Oyu. He never reached the top, but he was like on 8,400 meters altitude. But he was not good in that, and he somehow learned that, or he always said that then, that he has much more adventure if he's in our Alps, which are not that high, but without any security, than being carried up by a Sherpa to Mount Everest. And I think maybe there is a similarity to architecture, that you don't necessarily need to work all the time on the biggest or the most expensive and most prestigious projects. I think there is much more creativity and also much more topics to learn from in small projects, in social housing projects, in community-driven projects. And I think these are definitely a very interesting path to discover more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question regarding the community. So I'm a student from Mexico, and my question is about society and modular design. So I want to know, how could you avoid from falling on the building for one type of user with a modular concept design, and how could you involve all types of people and create a community with your architecture, involving the topic avoiding the typical big company building narrative where they choose the user that will inhabit the space?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Juan, because this is somehow the fundamental challenge, I think, in modular design, because you create something like the international style is basically a modular design, right? But then you create cities that look everywhere the same, that somehow blend into the background, where nothing is excited in architecture anymore. Or in Russia in the 60s, which was very modular driven, but actually the buildings were everything but exciting. But I think there is also a possibility in modular design to create spaces for something to happen in between. So I think the beauty of modular design is also that you give somehow a framework, but what happens within the framework can be also decided by the community or by the user. But it's somehow it's somewhere a very slippery slope between this, because of course you want to, as an architect, you also want to design something that is authentic, for example, to a local building tradition. But if you design something modular, for example, for Canada, why should that also work in Mexico? So for this one, it probably doesn't. And maybe modular design, you need to figure out where it actually makes sense to use it, and where it just doesn't. And I think that's you as an architect to decide that. Yeah, but it's the more space you give for unexpected things to happen, so that actually you as an architect, you take yourself at a certain point out of the equation, or you don't determine everything that have to happen in this, but you leave free space for personality. And I think that's a very interesting path to develop.
So,
Hello.
sorry,
Hi,
go
Chris.
ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Chris. I have a bit of a technical question for you. Uh, I would like to know what are the on-site challenges that you face while creating your designs, uh, with dealing with so many vendors and uh, so many engineers and structural engineers. What maybe if there's a funny story that you would probably want to share with us.
Funny. um, yeah, especially when it comes to site, the learning process within the last 6 or 7 years was immense. I think the most successful project when it comes now to site is for sure Bird, our treehouse, and this one was or is pretty successful in the process. We are actually, we had this kind of time schedule. We are not 1 day late, and we are not €1 too expensive at the moment. So, we like within the last year, we really kept at a really precision to the schedule, which was super surprising for everyone involved. But I think this happened because um, at a very early stage after we published it, we found immediately the wood builder who was able to build it, and the structure engineer who were able to calculate it. And usually, they would come, at least the wood builder would come much later into the process. But because they were so early in, we could develop everything together with those vendors and with the partners on the project. So that proved to be incredible successful. And we are working at the moment on a project in Portugal where we are doing exactly the same thing. It's much larger, but keeping also everything, all the people who are somehow involved, really in this circle. It's also a wood building, a very heavily prefabricated and transportable to site. So we, in this sense, it makes sense to keep everything as close together and develop everything together. And this was really one big lesson I learned in the last years.
Thanks.
So
Thank you so much.
I have a question about a little bit changing the topic of the conversation towards social media, which is probably how we got so many people to this event. So I was wondering about you mentioning the era of the Starchitect as being over. What do you mean by that? Do you think that's a good thing or is it a negative thing? And as we see how the role of social media becomes more and more important in our field, do you find any issues with an era of the influencer architect that might be approaching us?
So that the era of the Starchitect is over, I think it's more like a hope than a statement, maybe. But I could see that a younger generation of architects, they have just they're driven by different things. I think what mainly drives us or you guys is probably the purpose to really change something, and not the fame you're actually getting by doing that. And I think that's a very different thing. And also this era of the architect to be this sole creator and the sole face of a company. I think this one should be or will be also over, because architecture became much more complex. It's such a big teamwork now, where everyone is involved. Architecture doesn't get decided anymore by standing 2 hours on the site and being inspired in your black suit and red scarf by the site and then having the epiphany. hard work in a team to actually get the design that actually works. And with everything from technical aspects to building aspects to structural aspects, it became really, really complex, a project. So there is much more teamwork involved. And so my wish is somehow that this, that this single office in general is a bit over, and that that offices somehow collaborate with each other on projects. I think that somehow makes much more sense, like especially for young architects like us, right? That we, if we get, for example, a larger project that we cannot handle by ourselves because we don't have the manpower, I don't want to hire now 5 people, and if the project doesn't come through, I need to fire them. I have worked before in offices that operated exactly this way, right? An airport is coming, 20 people in, airport died, 25 people out. But I would hate to run an office this way. So I think it makes then much more sense to somehow share, the fees with a collaborating office. For example, how we work together with Arthur on this project that I just mentioned. And then, but also share then, the skill sets offices have. A lot of, Arthur has his skill sets in rapid prototyping and in new technologies. We have it more, maybe in landscaping, in plants and in modular design and so. So I think, you find then always a middle ground with other offices, and you can learn from each other. So I would somehow see it much more like bands, somehow collaborating on an album with each other, and then it would be somehow a much nicer way in architecture and the architectural community if a new generation, I think, would handle their project this way. And the second part of your question about the social media, I would see a problem maybe in social media. Of course, there are bad sides and there are positive sides. But if you would just create for social media as an architect, I would see a problem in this, because then architecture becomes or can become very superficial. There was this competition for the burnt church in Paris. Actually, it was not a competition, but just a lot of architects were driven by their egos and just designed the stupidest things, what it could be. Some funny, some good, some really stupid. But I think it didn't do the architectural community any favors, because it was, of course, it was on the scene, but it was also in the New York Times and in a lot of media that a lot of public saw outside of architecture. And as the Parisian people then said, don't let any architect near this building to do anything with it. They are all crazy. So I think if it becomes really just something you create for your 2 minutes of fame on social media, then I think architecture can become really superficial. But of course, it can be also used for something different, right? Like, for example, bringing people together, or finding clients, or finding people who share a vision, or also, getting out of your own architectural bubble. So for me, I sometimes do this Let's Talk Architecture series, where I post a question on Instagram, and a lot of people are answering. And it's really not so much because I want to say something, but also that I can see, outside of my architectural bubble. I know that, I was very blessed with where I grew up, in the heart of Europe. It was, I had good universities here, although all public universities, but they were good universities. And it was quite easy, or comparably easy, for me to find an internship and get a job after between universities. But it was much more difficult, for example, for my wife, who was coming from the south of China, from a farm, and had to jump through so many more and more difficult hoops than I did that we arrive at the same stage. So like to get outside of your own bubble and really look into challenges from other people, I think it helps a lot. And in the end, it doesn't matter if people are from Bangladesh or from Sweden or from America. We deal with similar problems as this generation of architects, and there is a lot we can learn from each other and from each other's viewpoints. So I think in this sense, it can be used for the good and the bad and the ugly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I guess I have a question more about like education in architecture and like that field. So like as aspiring architects, we develop our own definition and sense about studio culture within the architectural education. And your vision towards future generations seems to rely on the idea of like sharing a community within the architecture field. So I was wondering, what advice would you give to current architecture students in terms of taking advantage of their surroundings, their colleagues, and professors? How has that shaped you as a person and architect that you are nowadays? And what would be the ideal studio culture that, and like, how do you manage that in your office? Like positivity, authenticity, and also, like working in teams. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, you ask how can you get more out from the atmosphere of the architectural school you're in, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a fair point, but I would maybe argue the opposite, right? Like sometimes I think it's really good to break out of that. Because I did the same when I was a student. I was so involved in my university. I was also tutoring at the university, and it was a lot of fun. So I somehow lost a lot of friends who were not architects, and I just hung out with other architects, and it created this kind of bubble that when like architectural speak comes after that, and when you explain something to a friend who is not an architect, they just shake their head. So I think it's sometimes very helpful to break out of this bubble as well, right? To connect with non-architects. I mean, it's a fair point, that you try to get everything out from professors, from your colleagues, and so forth, to make yourself better as an architect. But you also have to remember that other architects and your professors will never be your clients. So you also need to connect with people who potentially one day would be your clients. And this creates a different language, and it creates a different way you are actually explaining your projects. I think it would be maybe not bad at final crits to invite all of your parents and really hear what they think about your project, and not other professors and other architects, because I think you would present actually a project completely different, right? So this would be maybe one part of the answer, but of course, in hindsight and in retrospective, like my mistake maybe I made in university was that I was really interested in design and everything that dealt with design, and how to get better in that, and how to model better, how to render better, how to 3D print. And I was really interested in this. And about the other parts, I was not so interested, which proves to be difficult once you start your own office. It's okay if you are hired as an expert then in an office, but if you want to start your own studio, it proves really difficult, because there are so many. I think design maybe is just 10% of your tasks. There's so much things about office culture that I have never heard this word before in university. Team management. How do you get people passionate if you are starting as an office and you don't have the possibilities to pay the same fees, for example, than Aeropace or so. So there are so many questions that go beyond design that while you are in university, I would also try to create a very good relationship with those people and professors you are not so interested in at the moment. So, for example, structure, building technicians. So everything, where if you have your first project and you don't have the fees to actually hire consultants for this work, that you have somebody you can talk to for some general advice. So in hindsight, I totally missed this opportunity. It was all there at my public university where I went in Innsbruck and in Vienna, but I didn't take this by then into consideration. But I think you should.
Yes, thank you. Speaking on the education topic, there was a question in the comment section from Heather. If you would like to say your own question. Okay, I'll say it. So Heather says, "Hey Chris, it was an amazing talk. This audience is consisted of a lot of students. What do you recommend us to gain or grab from these years of education? What type of discussion should happen between us and professors and discussions with the seniors and batchmates? What should we not miss these years?" And I know a lot of us are asking about what should we be gaining right now, especially since education is so different.
I think what changed in education from when I was studying, which somehow seems centuries ago, is that like my first lecture was from Ketil Thorsen. He's the head of Snohetta, and he said the best architects study the longest, and this somehow stuck with me. I studied, I think, 9 or 10 years. I was one of the faster one in our university, but there were really people who studied like 20 years. I'm not recommending you to do that, but what changed also in Austria, and I was a teacher, I think 2 years ago in Münster in Germany, and what changes is due to this bachelor and master courses, you have a very strict somehow timeline, and this timeline is very busy, but it leaves you not the opportunities to fail a lot. I think what when I was studying, we made so many wrong turns in projects. Like we for example did for a whole year design course and didn't even submit it in the end because we were not happy with it. And I think this opportunity to really learn how to fail is something really fundamental as a student, because you will fail afterwards, be it in an office or in your own studio. And if you are not able to coping with that and learned how to fail, it will prove to be really difficult. For example, I used to do ski jumping until I was 18 years old. Like I went to a very good school for ski jumping. And the first thing actually we learned in ski jumping is how to fall down. Because then you will fall one way or another in your life as a ski jumper. And if you don't learn how to fall, you will injure yourself a lot. And the same, I think, is somehow true to your students, to being a student. I think learning how to fail and learning how to cope with designs that don't work, where you work yourself into a rabbit hole and you cannot get out anymore, and you go deeper and deeper. And then this point, where you really tell yourself, okay, from this one, I break out now. I don't give up, but I restart, I rethink, I know what I have to do in order to find a new inspiration. I think these are some fundamental lessons you have to learn as a student.
Okay, I have a question. Can I ask? I'm Dmitro. I'm from Ukraine, and now I'm studying in Italy. But I have actually a bit personal question, more also about your business model. I'm actually it's a bit. I would say I will understand if you don't answer, and it's about how do you start your work in Beijing, and why did you choose to go there? Actually, it's like different country, etc., etc. Is it because you won a competition in China and you had a kind of field or database of clients because of that, or you have some kind of friends who could help you to build your new company? Because when you went back to Austria, you already had some kind of reputation that you got in China, and yeah, it's interesting to analyze how you started.
Sure. Of course, I answer this. I like personal questions. I went actually much earlier to China for the first time. It was in 2008, right before the Olympic Games. I went there because I had no idea about China. And it was really for me, and back then I think it was for a lot of people, this kind of, like a gray kind of land over the map, and you didn't really know what was going on in the country. At least it felt, as a stupid foreigner, it felt for me like this. So I was really interesting to, and of course, due to the Olympic Games, there was a lot written in the media, and I just, and very one-sided, of course, like in every media. So I wanted to see it for myself and experience it for myself. And so I wrote just to, I think, 2 offices in Beijing, if they, would take me as an intern. And yeah, I got an internship, and I went there without knowing any Chinese, without knowing anyone there. And for a 3 months internship, and this one then, I stayed there for 2 years. Not just as an intern, I was then employed as well. But it was a really interesting time, because due to Olympic Games, China opened, and that meant a lot of opportunities, a lot of investment. Back then it was also, as superficial as it might sound, that foreigners, there were a lot of projects going towards foreigners. Back then I was still working for Kraft, for the company. So I didn't have my own office. But then in 2010, then I met, of course, my wife. She's Chinese, and then we went both back to Vienna to study, to do our master degree. But then after the master degree, somehow, we had already roots there. So it made somehow sense to go there. And I think it was for sure the right decision, because, as you said, we were able to get then to opportunities in China that I would have never had as a young architect in Austria, to work on really interesting projects. And then, yes, reputation maybe, but when we moved here, no one in my village or in the neighboring village knows that I'm an architect. So, a reputation in a very, very small circle of nerdy people, maybe, but it's not a reputation that somehow helps you get a local project here. Yeah. But of course, it helped to somehow build up the portfolio in a way yeah, to somehow get an experience, although a different kind of experience in China, but nevertheless experience that makes you grow as an architect.
Thank you. But actually, what gives you opportunity to get some local projects, as you said? Like your reputation, did it help you so much, but what helped you?
With local, I think it's very, like, for example, if I would open up a restaurant and it would be a local restaurant, I would tell the guests who come first, don't tell anyone that this restaurant exists. Like, you know, this somehow is maybe how you do marketing on the countryside, because there's a lot of chatting about some new things and new people and so. But if you somehow come in and say, here we are, you know, that's the completely wrong way of marketing. It should, like, especially on the countryside, honesty in a way, but honesty in the way of authenticity is really important. So somehow, you know, we are hiding here in the mountain, right? And we don't say a lot about ourselves, but we somehow are patient enough that we are found by locals. And now we are really in a stage where we get an incredible amount of projects, maybe also due to COVID. You know, people have now time to think and rethink, for example, what projects they want to do, what hotels they want to build, maybe a bit more ecological hotel. And I think we built there already a bit of a base that we are in this niche of ecological buildings. But you know, we try to be found, and then that also results, of course, in a place where you have to say no to a lot of people. Then, you know, those people also say to other people, oh no, he couldn't take my project, but maybe, you know, you have the chance. Or, you know, it creates some kind of marketing that lives for itself. So I think if you get in a stage where you're found by people, it's a much different place to operate an architectural studio, because you have a different relationship. So you are not interviewing for a job. The client is interviewing that you take his project, and with the fear that you can say no. And that puts you in every little process in a project in a much different level, and everything goes much smoother with projects. So I think that's somehow, yeah, like guerrilla marketing, I think is a good tool for architects, yeah, and especially in the countryside.
Thank you very much.
Just to start closing it out, just a tangent off of that, I wanted to ask, like, so a lot of students, like especially right now, may feel some sort of doubt when they get close to their graduation year, fearing that they can't get a job. So I'm just curious, like, how did you handle opportunities like immediately post-graduation? Like, was it challenging or easy? And just how did you overcome some failures that you may have experienced in that time?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good question to actually end this talk, because it's a very personal question. And so is actually architecture, right? Like, it is so personal, as I said before, because so much of your own story is in the projects you're creating, that you make yourself very vulnerable on a lot of fronts. And that makes you anxious as a student, but that never stops. Like, the same is true when I started the office. The same is true to me now. I'm very anxious, you know, to fail, to be not good enough, to don't have a good idea for a project when we take on a new one. So this one never stops, and I think it also will never stop. I think, you know, like the biggest architects in the world are still feeling anxious, and you know, with the feeling of not being good enough. It is because, you know, creativity is just a very personal process, and you make yourself very vulnerable because there's so much of your personality quality in the project. And when a professor is criticizing your work, you feel he's not criticizing just your project, but also part of yourself, and that, you know, it hurts. But I think that's also the beautiful thing about creativity, because it is very honest. It is a very honest process, and I think architecture would be boring if this feeling of anxiety and vulnerability wouldn't exist in this process.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you again for coming to this. Thank you everyone for showing up. I know it's really late for you, Chris, so I'll let you get back to your family. But again, thank you so much for coming to this. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There were a lot of great questions down there. And yeah, we have a few more events in the future. There's a link that we sent out if you would like to come see the schedule. But yeah, Chris, if you have any last words.
No, thank you guys for being here. It was a very interesting experience to actually see so many faces in a lecture. Usually the audience is very dark, so it's a very different experience. So a cool one. Thanks guys for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Love this chat. All right. Look at all the Zooms. So that was, yeah. That was a great conversation. I'm really happy with that.
Just so you know, the lecture is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. So you can
Thank
go
you for
watch
that.
it.
And the YouTube channel is Pratt SOA Events. Let me stop.